Hey, is there somebody from the Barkley Forum that's time?
You guys are already on the side, right? Yeah. Fort Lauderdale's first and front. Okay. Comments? Right? Yeah. Three judges? My partner and I affirm the resolution resolved. The plea bargaining undermines the criminal justice system. We offer the following observation. All the resolution asks of the pros to show that in the status quo, plea bargaining undermines the criminal justice system. Thus, we are not required to advocate for a ban on plea bargaining or provide alternatives, but rather only evaluate what occurs now. Accordingly, Professor Lipp lists two goals in any criminal justice system. One, to separate the innocent from the guilty, and two, to assign punishments to offenders that reflect the seriousness of their crimes. If any one of these pillars of justice are undermining the status quo, they serve as independent reasons to affirm. Contention 1. Plea bargaining causes racial discrimination. Dr. Savitsky explains why blacks are disproportionately targeted by prosecutors by stating that since prosecutors are interested in maximizing prosecutions, they are thus encouraged to prosecute a disproportionate number of African Americans. This greatly degrades fairness as he furthers, the set of all bargains that a black defendant will be willing to agree to includes higher sentences than for a similarly situated white defendant. Savitsky explains why in stating, when a white person plea bargains, he is likely able to win greater concessions from prosecutors because he is in a better bargaining position to begin with. That is, a white defendant has more faith in the criminal justice system that he will receive a fair trial, and thus he believes that it takes more than simply guilt to be found guilty. Contention 2. The use of informants through plea bargaining is detrimental. According to the University of Cincinnati Law Review, a criminal informant is a person who trades information about others in order to obtain lenience for his or her own crimes, especially through plea bargaining. The use of plea bargaining to incentivize informants draws two negative impacts to the criminal justice system. First, increased crime. According to Professor Alexandria Nadapoff, informants participate in and generate crime, contribute to the tolerance of crime, and are forgiven for their own crimes undeservedly. Moreover, Nadapoff furthers, criminal gangs routinely use violence to prevent snitching and punish informants. Thus, plea bargaining, through its use of informants, achieves the opposite of its intended goals, more crime. Second, informants are unreliable and lead to the conviction of innocence. According to Northwestern University, 45.9% of documented wrongful capital convictions have been traced to false informant testimony, making informants the leading cause of wrongful convictions in U.S. capital cases. Moreover, Nadapoff also points out that 20% of all of California's wrongful convictions, capital or otherwise, result from this false informant testimony. Contention 3. Plea bargaining undermines the goals of the criminal justice system. This is true in two unique areas. The first is that plea bargaining utilizes probation to the extreme. According to the RAND Corporation, between 60 and 80% of all convicted criminals are sentenced to probation, most of whom through plea bargaining. Professor Dean Champion reports that probation is used twice as much through plea bargaining compared to its usage in felony convictions through trial. The impact of this is that according to the RAND Corporation, 65% of probationers are rearrested, 51% are reconvicted, and 34% are reincarcerated within the terms of their probation. Plea bargaining enables convicted felons to remain on our streets so that they can commit more crimes, acting counterintuitively to its intent and the intent of the criminal justice system. Second, plea bargaining increases the rate at which the innocent are convicted. This is true in three independent areas. First, prosecutorial coercion is a major cause of the innocence problem. Fordham University reports that prosecutors have been known to file prosecutions when there is no better than a 50% likelihood that the defendant is guilty, charging two individuals with the same act, knowing that both cannot be guilty. Moreover, according to Professor Erika Hashimoto, prosecutors require waivers of exculpatory evidence as a condition of guilty pleas. She furthers that this may cause the accused to believe their chances of success at trial do not outweigh the risks of higher sentences that would be imposed upon conviction at trial. Second, more police work. Dr. Paul Roberts of Stanford University explains, plea bargaining is a major cause of wrongful convictions because it undermines police investigative work. Because few cases go to trial, police have learned that their evidence is seldom tested in the courtroom, and these sloppy investigations that result are less likely to lead to the apprehension of the guilty and more likely to convict the innocent. Third, innocent convictions through plea bargaining are empirically confirmed. According to Professor Richard Leo, the high conviction rates of false confessors are greater when considering the number of false confessors who plead guilty rather than take their cases to trial. Counting the false confessors in both samples, more than 85% were wrongfully convicted. This necessarily means that vast numbers of guilty people are unjustly on the streets while innocent people sit in prison, directly as a result of plea bargaining. In conclusion, we urge you to affirm today's resolution. Thank you.
Partner ready? Opponents ready? Judges ready? Okay. Because plea bargaining helps to uphold the three main goals of the criminal justice system, which according to the Department of Justice are 1. Administer justice, 2. Facilitate criminal correction, and 3. Maximize public obedience, we negate result. In the United States, plea bargaining undermines the criminal justice system. Contention 1. Plea bargaining maximizes prosecutorial efficiency. Orrin Barkley of NYU finds that the prosecutor's resource and time constraints do not allow him or her to take every single defendant to trial. As a result, prosecutors have to turn to quicker, less resource-heavy methods of prosecution. Plea bargaining has allowed the criminal justice system to function efficiently and to make sure that guilty people are being prosecuted. Douglas Smith of the University of Maryland agrees, quote, "The primary advantage of a system of negotiated pleas is that it allows prosecutors to pursue more cases than otherwise would be possible. The impact of this is that, first, were it not for plea bargaining, the number of guilty defendants prosecuted would be significantly lower. Because plea bargaining allows the criminal justice system to better fulfill its function of delivering justice, the system is upheld rather than undermined. Additionally, as a result of plea bargaining, the criminal justice system can more effectively deter crime. Douglas Smith finds that the result of a plea bargaining system is that laws are applied to a larger base of offenders. His increased certainty that no crime will go unpunished deters potential law offenders from committing crimes. Because plea bargaining allows more defendants to undergo the criminal justice process, two key functions, delivering justice and maximizing public obedience, are upheld. Contention 2. Plea bargaining sentences foster better criminal correction. Subpoint A. Long incarceration fosters recidivism. Draconian sentencing guidelines have had a wholly negative effect on prisoners' rehabilitation. This occurs for two reasons. First, according to Lynn Song of Washington State University, quote, "Prison is a school for criminals, and those who are incarcerated for a longer period of time become more sophisticated and entrenched criminals." Second, a study by the Journal of Quantitative Criminology found that the longer a person is removed from society, the weaker his or her social bonds become. Weakened social bonds make it harder for defendants to reintegrate into society, increasing an offender's inclination to recidivate or commit further crimes after release. A meta-analysis of recidivism studies by Francis Cohen of the University of Cincinnati found that a sentence reduction from 30 months to 12.9 months for the same crime resulted in an 11% decrease in recidivism. Plea bargaining contributes to this decrease because, according to Jeff Palmer, writing in the American Journal of Criminal Law, plea bargaining sentences average about one-half of the original sentence. Subpoint B. Plea bargaining prevents prison overcrowding. According to the Washington Examiner, quote, "Officers are being asked for quantity, not quality. As a result, police are becoming more focused on cracking down on low-level crime because it is safer and easier to put a stop to. Were it not for plea bargaining, a significantly larger percent of offenders of petty crimes would be destined for prison rather than the probation that they receive as punishment through plea bargaining." According to Dean Champion, professor at criminal justice at Texas A&M University, 80% of sentences involve probation as a result of plea bargaining. According to Douglas Smith, only 42% of defendants are incarcerated after pleading guilty, whereas 71% are incarcerated at trial. Because plea bargaining prevents huge numbers of these petty crime offenders from being incarcerated as a form of punishment, extreme prison overcrowding is prevented. As a result, the criminal justice system can facilitate criminal correction more effectively. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, overcrowding has a direct impact on prison administration. The same number of staff has to deal with a larger number of inmates, leading to less supervision and the weakened ability of institutions to engage in programs conducive to reintegration. Because prison overcrowding places such a huge strain on prison rehabilitation programs, recidivism rates increase as a result. In fact, the Chicago Law Review identifies prison overcrowding as the main cause of recidivism. Because plea bargaining prevents this prison overcrowding by using probation as a punishment for petty crimes, it upholds the last key goal of the criminal justice system, facilitating criminal correction. In conclusion, because plea bargaining helps to uphold the three main goals of the criminal justice system, which again are to 1. Administer justice, 2. Facilitate criminal correction, and 3. Maximize public obedience, we urge a negation.
Okay, so near the end of your case, for your subpoint B that you just read, you said that 46% of people are convicted through plea bargaining and 71% are convicted at trial. Right, so doesn't that mean that about 30% of people that would have been found not guilty at trial, like overall, would have been convicted?
No, we're saying that through plea bargaining rather than incarceration, the punishment is probation.
Right, so why is that a good thing if people recidivize more, more frequently and more, immediately when they have probation?
Actually, Francis Collin found that people who receive probation as a punishment are 7% less likely to recidivate than those who go through incarceration.
Right, but let me ask a question to analyze that a little more. Now, if someone, say, gets 30 years for killing someone when they're 20, they'll get out of prison when they're 50. Now, who's more likely to commit a crime? Someone that commits a crime immediately and then goes back out on the street, or someone that's behind bars for 30 years and is away from society?
Okay, but we show you that being away from society for this long is actually what weakens these social bonds, which makes the person more likely to recidivate.
But isn't that 30 years where they can't harm society as compared to the immediate ability to harm society when you have probation?
Okay, but we show you that in those when they
Well, wait, do you agree to that?
for those 30 years while they're in jail, they technically can't commit a crime.
So that's better, because for 30 years they can do no harm to society. Doesn't that outweigh that?
No, because we're showing that they're less likely to commit a crime when they do get out.
Right, but that's 30 years when there's 0% chance they harm society.
So should we just infinitely lock up everyone who commits any sort of crime so that they can't do it again?
I mean, I would say that if someone murders someone, yeah, they deserve to be in jail for an infinitely long amount of time, but that's just my opinion. But do you have a question for me?
Sure. You talk about innocent convictions. Can you show how many people are being wrongly innocent people are being wrongly convicted?
Well, as per our Leo evidence, we show it in two separate areas in our case. When we talk about informants, 46% of people that receive capital punishment or go on death row aren't actually guilty, and they're put there as a result of informants through plea bargaining. But our Leo evidence shows that 85% of people that are innocent but are found guilty are done so because of plea bargaining. So 85%.
Okay, for the 45.9% being from false testimony.
Of all people that get capital punishment or are sentenced to it.
Okay, but that's not specific to plea bargaining.
Yes, it is. If you look to our University of Cincinnati Law Review evidence, we actually explain that when you review legal literature, an informant is someone that gives testimony in exchange for plea bargaining or in exchange for reducing their own sentence, which at its core is plea bargaining. But I have another question for you.
Sure.
So let's say tomorrow everyone decides to exercise their constitutional right to go to trial. Okay?
Okay.
What happens?
Well, the problem,
Does the system collapse?
the thing that we have to realize though is that
Does the system collapse?
I mean, can you show how likely it would be that tomorrow every single person would randomly?
Well, you're
just
completely
decide to
skirting the
commit a
question
crime?
because you know my point is that if everyone were to decide to exercise their constitutional right to a trial, the Department of Justice wouldn't say, oops, they would increase resources and give everyone their
Okay.
constitutionally guaranteed
But
rights.
when you look to what empirically happens, that doesn't happen.
When did
Otherwise-
everyone decide to go to trial?
No, what we're saying is that's exactly my point.
So
They
you're just
don't
showing isolated bans?
No, that's not.
So at the top of my opponent's case, they basically list three goals of the criminal justice system. They basically agree with our framework. If we can show that just one of these areas is undermined, we should win the debate. So go over to their first contention where they talk about this idea how prosecutorial efficiency is fostered through plea bargaining, and they say that it allows it to pursue maximal cases. But insofar as it's even possible that there exists alternatives to plea bargaining that can reach the same ends without any of the harms that we offer, you can't really look to this point. And indeed, the University of Pennsylvania came up with a viable alternative such as bench trials, where the judge at the back of the courtroom actually adjudicates the case instead of a jury. This would only require a 6% increase in the amount of resources and has none of the harms that we have to offer. But secondarily, in terms of their efficiency point, you can use it against them because according to Harvard University, 69% of plea bargaining cases would not even see the light of day in trial because there is not enough evidence to convict. The cases would be dismissed if plea bargaining didn't exist. In other words, we're freeing up the system insofar as it's true that plea bargaining is sending people to jail or through probation that ought not be sent in the first place. What about their argument under their first contention from deterrence, where they basically say that the certainty of crime is better than the severity of crime? Two responses. One, according to the University of Texas, severity is always going to outweigh the certainty of crime because criminals are rational agents. For example, if I want to rob a bank, I do so for the rational reason that I need more money. Now, why does Saudi Arabia have a higher or lower crime rate than the United States? Because their punishments are significantly more severe. I'm not advocating for beheadings, but I think that exemplifies the point that severe punishment is better than the certainty. And indeed, this is confirmed empirically by Northwestern University, which came to the conclusion that in the past decades, when there was an increase of 30% incarceration rate, there was a decrease in 5%. Why? Because when you put people, or decrease of crime by 5%. Why? Because when you put people in jail, they're not able to reoffend immediately, whereas if you send them to probation, they're able to reoffend immediately, which means that there's a greater harm to society. What about their second contention where they talk about this idea that it's better for the criminal correction, and they talk about incarceration? They say that the prisons are essentially a school of crime. One, I would say that you can use this argument against them because even if it is a school of crime, you're still actually incarcerating them, which means at least in the immediate future, they're never going to be able to commit a crime against society. Whereas if you put them on probation, 65% of them are going to be able to reoffend immediately. So insofar as that's true with probation, even if there is a higher recidivism rate with incarceration, they're not able to do it immediately, which means you're going to outweigh on that. Secondarily, according to the New York Times, it is directly because of plea bargaining that the probation system is overburdened because we're sending a disproportionate amount of people into the probation system. Because it's overburdened, probationers feel the need that they're never going to get caught for committing even more crimes, which ultimately means that we're going to be increasing the amount of crimes. And remember, 65% of these probationers are going to reoffend. What about their argument from overcrowding in their second subpoint, where they basically say that police are expected quantity, not quality? Well, that's actually an argument for our side because according to Stanford University, the reason why police officers currently go after quality or quantity and not quality is because of plea bargaining. They don't need to gather as much evidence because the vast majority of cases don't go to trial. It's an innocent conviction, so you can use their argument against them. What about this idea that where they say under Champion that 80% of people are given probation, and they talk about petty crimes. But Champion actually says that 80% of felons are given probation, which means that while we're letting the pot smokers on the, or the students who smoke pot on the street through probation, we're also letting the killers who go on the campus to kill them on the street as well. So insofar as that's true, you're always going to accept or weigh our side over theirs. What about this idea that the overcrowding system is actually a major cause of recidivism? Their entire overcrowding argument can be used against them because according to Dr. Douglas Savitsky, he says that the reason why this prison system is overcrowded is because through plea bargaining, blacks are disproportionately sent to prisons, which means we have a disproportionate amount of minorities in our prison system. That's why we have the overcrowding system. That's the conclusion he makes. He says the drug war has something to do with it, but the major cause is plea bargaining. Secondarily, according to Kenneth Kibbins, people who are certain to get prison time, but who cannot be convicted at trial are convicted through plea bargaining, which means the prosecutorial coercion is causing the overcrowding system. Thus, I urge you to affirm. Thank you.
Starting with my opponent's first contention where they talk about race bias, we have three responses to this. First, according to Jack Riley of the Rand Corporation, white minority sentence disparities are virtually non-existent in plea deals because the prosecutors have the obligation to be ethical in order to get reelected. At that point, there is an incentive for prosecutors not to be racist, so there is a check on the system. Second, according to Irene Blair of the American Psychological Society, she finds that when tried in court, people with Afrocentric facial features receive a 7 to 8 month longer sentence than those with non-Afrocentric facial features who committed identical crimes. So at that point, that is a non-unique impact. Third, it is racial bias that is undermining the criminal justice system, not plea bargaining. So at the point where race bias is still going to be a non-unique impact, it is not plea bargaining that is undermining the criminal justice system, but rather the perceived racism of the system. So at that point, my opponents aren't getting any impacts off of this. Then go down to where they talk about lying in testimony. We have a few responses to this as well. First of all, according to George C. Harris, writing in the Pepperdine Law Review, the state is required to disclose the complete criminal history of the informant, any deal that the offering party has made and will make in the future. So at that point, the credibility of this person is going to be completely undermined. There's no reason for them to actually, for people to actually buy into this false testimony. So then my opponent's going to talk about how there's an increase in crime. That's not true. According to Bill McCarthy, sociology professor at the University of Toronto, he says that the decision to cooperate in crime is a decision to trust, and plea bargaining undermines that because when people are allowed to testify in plea bargains, there's a deterrent effect that plea bargaining provides because people know that they might get ratted out. Then my opponent's going to talk about how there's a conviction of the innocent. They say there's 45.9% of innocent convictions are due to false convictions. First of all, this study is not specific to plea bargaining, so you can't attribute that automatically. Second of all, my opponents try to say that 46% of innocent people are being convicted. That's not true at all. This study just says that 45.9% of innocent convictions are due to false testimony. It never even links to plea bargaining. The false testimony can come from other places. So again, this is a non-unique impact. Then our opponent's going to talk about probation. We have a few responses to that as well. According to Valerie Wright of the Sentencing Project, she finds that being incarcerated versus remaining in the community was associated with a 7% increase in recidivism. At the point where incarceration results in more recidivism than probation, we can clearly see that point is going to the negative. She says that this happens when prisoners remain in the community, offenders are more likely to maintain their ties to family, employers, and community, all of which promote re-entry into society. Conversely, when prisoners serve longer sentences, they are more likely to become institutionalized and lose pro-social contracts with the community and become removed from legitimate opportunities, all of which promote recidivism. So at the point where probation is helping, not hurting, we can clearly vote negative on this. Then our opponents want to talk about innocent convictions. They basically stipulate that people are being coerced into plea deals. That's simply not true. According to Orrin Bargill, a law professor at NYU, he finds that due to docket pressure and prosecutors lack the time to even pursue some winnable cases. Prosecutors in most jurisdictions have far more cases than they have time to handle them, because in many cases the prosecutors cannot afford to go to trial and the defendants know it. The threat to the defendant is simply not credible. But second, according to the Columbia Law Review, there's a check on this coercion system because the judges have to realize that the plea bargain is in fact A, factually based, and B, voluntary. So if it violates any of those two, the plea bargain is rejected. So at that point, my opponent's coercion point falls. Then they go on to talk about the sloppy police work. But at the point where 10% of cases still go to trial, the police do have the incentive to get good evidence, so there's no real impact here. Then going back to the McCon case. Our opponents respond to our first contention by giving you this Harvard Law Review card, but this is more flawed than Sarah Palin's reasoning for why she's credible in foreign policy. According to Michael Finkelstein, who wrote the study, says we only have an uncertain estimate of what would happen if police dropped to 20% of all defendants in a district. At the point where there are 94 districts of the United States, we can clearly see that Finkelstein isn't actually, he's making a complete estimate and assumptions based on this. In fact, on page 3, he says that, I thus pose the following question: what proportion of those pleading guilty in federal courts would not have been convicted if they had contested their cases? This proportion, which I shall call the implicit rate of conviction, cannot be directly observed, but rather it can be estimated for groups of defendants on the basis of plausible assumptions. At the point where Finkelstein is just estimating, just assuming that this is going to happen, our opponents cannot get any offense off of this. In response to our deterrence point, our opponents say that the 30% increase in incarceration reduced crime by 5%. This is certainty of punishment, so we must negate the resolution.
I have the first question.
Yeah.
All right. Judges ready? Okay. So in response to our racism point, you basically said that prosecutors have the ethical obligation in order to get elected. Now, how do you respond to the idea that isn't there an added incentive in terms that they have to get their conviction rates up, and therefore they should exploit the least off?
That doesn't mean that they would go disproportionately for African Americans, but rather they would go for everyone. What do you mean?
You didn't respond to our evidence.
Okay.
Well, let me ask you this.
The idea that they go disproportionately for African Americans would only we can only conclude that would mean that the prosecutor is biased against African Americans.
No,
right?
There's an added incentive because plea bargaining gives you the incentive to go after the less off to get the conviction rate up. Let me ask you this: why do whites get better bargains than blacks?
I'm not sure, and I
Because
empirically
plea
prove
bargaining rewards the prosecutors for for exploiting
Okay.
those who are less.
That
less
directly
off.
contradicts what Jack Riley says when the Rand Corporation, when he says that white minority disparity is not because of race bias, but rather, like you said, because of institutional things, and it's not because of
What do
plea
you mean
bargaining.
institutional things?
Like you said, like the idea that people perceive
What
the criminal
incentive-
justice system to be
What
racist.
incentive does a jury have
Okay.
to convict someone
The
based on
idea
race?
that people perceive the criminal justice system to be racist pushes them to offer not so lenient plea deals.
no,
That has nothing to
excuse
do
me.
with plea bargaining undermining the criminal justice
Here's
system.
why. African Americans typically believe that the criminal justice system is going to work against them. That's why prosecutors, through plea bargaining, exploit them.
But that's
And
not plea
excuse me.
bargaining undermining the criminal
Yes, it
justice
is.
system.
It's giving them the
That's
ability.
perceived racism undermining the criminal justice system.
No, they're using plea bargaining as a means to an end so that they get the maximum convictions, and they're targeting disproportionately African Americans because they know they're less.
Okay, that's
worse
maybe
off.
an abuse of the system, but
That's why
not
whites
plea
get
bargaining.
better bargains than blacks and Hispanics.
Okay.
You're not responding to the evidence.
All right, I have a question for you
Sure.
really quickly. You talked about how when there's a 30% increase in incarceration, there's a decrease of 5%, right? Okay, so how is that not certainty of punishment rather than severity? Because you're increasing the fact that people are going to jail.
No, it's severity. Your entire case is predicated on the assumption that probation is good and that incarceration is bad. My response was this idea that incarceration is good because it decreases crime in the short and the long term. The reasoning is that when you give someone probation and they recommit, they're able to do so immediately. But even if a criminal who is incarcerated recommits, they have to take 20 years or 10 years or even 5 years. Anything
So
is
doesn't
more
that
than
make the
probation.
Cohen study much more awesome? Because we can see that there's a 7% less recidivism rate coming from probation than incarceration, even when that's taken into account.
No, I'm sorry, it didn't take that into account. You have
Yes, it did.
excuse me, you have to prove to me that it is better that a person gets probation, is able to immediately reoffend, whereas a person
Okay,
goes to
the fact that they're
incarcerated.
immediately able to reoffend in probation, and the fact that there's still a lesser recidivism rate makes that study even makes probation even that much better.
Okay, basically you're just combating your study with my study. So since we're both providing you with evidence, again, let's look to the logic. If someone is given probation, they're able to immediately reoffend, and that's why 65% of them do. You never respond to my New York Times evidence where he said that the reason why the probation system is so screwed up is because of plea bargaining.
Other judges? So look to the fact that they dropped our framework. Remember, that means that if we show either the plea bargaining undermines the fact that you're separating the guilty from the innocent or punishment's not paying the crimes to default to the pro. Additionally, you don't have to advocate for a ban or provide alternatives. They concede our framework. Look to our first contention about racial discrimination. There are please three responses. The first is that there's an obligation to be ethical. Our empirics from Savitsky mean that it doesn't matter if they have an obligation, they're not doing it. Group their second and third responses because they basically say the same thing. You have to remember that plea bargaining is the only system that's going to be rewarding racism. Even if it happens at trial, they're not rewarded for it. But under plea bargaining, you reward racism, giving it a greater incentive to occur. Look to our second contention about informants. Now they say, in response to our native pop evidence, credibility of these informants is going to be undermined if they lie. They're not trying to be credible, they're just trying to get out of a one-time thing where they're not trying to go to prison for one time. And additionally, even if you just look to our empirical evidence, even if they're trying to be credible, they're not credible because 46% of them are going to cause wrongful convictions of people that are going to be sentenced to the death penalty as per our native pop, or as per our Northwestern University evidence. That's say it isn't specific to plea bargaining. Remember that the drop definition from the University of Cincinnati? It says an informant is someone that plea bargains in exchange for testimony. That means that, their response isn't responsive. Look to our third contention about undermining the goals of the criminal justice system towards probation. They say incarceration is good, or incarceration causes more recidivism. Even if this is true, remember that they conceded in the first crossfire that these people should be off the streets. Extend our RAND evidence where 65% of them were going to be reoffending. And remember our New York Times evidence that my partner brought up in his last speech that was dropped, where we show you that the reason the probation system has so many problems is because it's overflooded through plea bargains. But look to our second subpoint about innocent conviction. Now their response to the coercion is that people have more cases than they handle, so the Fordham evidence isn't true. Remember that this is empirical, it happens now, it's not theoretics. Our Hashimoto evidence is dropped. Remember that they're denying people rights to evidence that would exonerate them. Then they try to say that there's going to be a check on coercion by the judges. Look to Georgetown University that says that plea bargaining removes the check from the judges by giving power to the prosecutors. Remember the police work argument. They say 10% will still go to trial. That's irrelevant because in all cases, there's sloppy police work because it won't go to trial in most cases. Extend our Leo evidence where 85% of those wrongfully convicted were done so through plea bargaining. And finally, extend our Harvard evidence because saying that there's only an uncertain estimate, that's what a scientific study is. They control for variables, come to a conclusion, and the conclusion is 69% would not be convicted. Thus, I urge you to affirm.
So, my opponents accepted our 3 key points that we gave at the beginning of our constructive, where we said that we need to look to the impact that plea bargaining has on administering justice, maximizing public obedience, and correcting criminals. But they say that they only have to prove one. First of all, we have to realize that we should look at what provides most overall benefits or harms. They don't only have to prove one. They have to show that it does more harm than good. First, looking to administrative justice, we show in our case that prosecutors don't have an infinite number of hours in the day. Logically, because of that, they can't take everyone through the criminal justice system. My opponents talked about how we only need a 6% increase in resources to switch to an alternative, but they say in their own framework that they don't have to consider alternatives in this debate, so we can't give that any weight in this round. Moving on to public obedience, we show you that because of the increased certainty that we provide through the increased amount of people going through the criminal justice system, we're increasing deterrence. My opponents say that severity is more important than certainty because criminals are rational and they don't want severe crimes, but we also have to realize that they don't want to be punished at all. If we're increasing the certainty that they are going to be punished, that is going to deter them from crime. Furthermore, we show you that severity is actually bad because it negatively affects the recidivism rates, which brings us to our third key goal, criminal correction. We show you that logically that prison access to school for criminals, that the longer you're incarcerated, the weaker your social bonds become, making it difficult to reintegrate into society. And we gave you the Francis Cone meta-analysis that showed that when sentences were reduced by about 17 months, recidivism rates decreased by about 11%. My opponents talk about how it's good to be incarcerated because they cannot commit any crime while they're in jail, but by that logic, everyone who commits a crime should be incarcerated for life. My opponents say at the beginning of their constructive that the punishment needs to fit the crime. If that's their logic, then this would be undermined, so this does not make any sense. Rather, we should look to what best achieves the most effective punishment in deterring crime, which we show plea bargaining achieves, and for these reasons, we urge negation.
So what's the overall recidivism rate for prisoners?
I don't have. Do you have that number?
I mean, you're just telling us it's 7% greater than whatever number we have, so it's kind of your burden to tell us what the actual number is. And
No,
not just
like
7%
if it's 7% higher, it doesn't matter what the actual number is because we solve it better.
Well,
but I
it
have a
does.
question
I
for
mean,
you.
basically, you're just trying to cross-apply a piece of evidence. It says in their study it was 7% higher, and saying that overall it's 7% higher.
Okay, their study took into account over 300,000 offenders. It was a meta-analysis of over 50 recidivism studies.
Oh,
This is the most legitimate study in the round. It should
Actually,
be
it's
looked
not
over
legitimate at all. If you look at the conclusion of the study, it says that read it.
Okay. These studies the studies reviewed contain precious little information on essential features. Furthermore, results emanating from this research must be approached with significantly more caution because of the nature of the database. Additionally, studies representative of this decade in other countries are urgently required. It basically concedes at the end that you can't use it for any policy implications because doesn't come to a substantive conclusion.
Okay.
But again, you're agreeing that you can't tell us what the recidivism rate, you just say it's pro plus 7?
I mean, yeah, but basically that's what it concludes, right? I mean, I don't.
Well,
I mean,
if our Harvard study is wrong because you
what
cited
if
in
the database was wrong with it? Okay, really quickly, actually,
I can re-explain it if you'd like me to.
No, I mean, really quickly,
It
what does Leo
contains
say?
precious little information on essential features. I
What
don't
does
just know
Leo
what they
say?
are. I know that the study itself is indicting itself.
What does Leo say?
Leo says that 85% of people that are wrongfully convicted are convicted through plea bargaining.
Is that true?
Yes.
Then how is it that 45.9% of innocent convictions happen through trial as a false testimony? Wouldn't that put it over 100%?
Excuse me, where is that from?
You yourself gave it in your case.
No, actually, the card we read from Northwestern University was referring only to capital cases. It's talking about people that get the death penalty. So you can misconstrue our evidence all you want.
So
But the truth of the
85%
matter
of innocent
is that 45.9% of people that are sentenced to capital offenses and sent to the death penalty are sent there wrongly and unjustly.
So how did Leo find this?
I mean, how did they find this? They looked at people that were exonerated, that were sitting on death row.
Okay, then why is it that Oren Ghazali, who also looked at exonerations, found that 94% of innocent convictions happened at trial?
Because that's the Innocence Project, and it only looked at 300 people that the Innocence Project exonerated.
What's the only what's the difference between your study and ours? Why is it better on your
My
side?
partner just explained that the
Because we only
sample
have a
size, excuse me,
size.
Why is 300 something not an
samples-
adequate sample
Can I
size?
please
Because we look at all of them.
Can I please respond? The Innocence Project is only looking at DNA exonerations and crimes where DNA was not available at the trial. Now we have DNA, so your evidence is not unique to the
I
crime.
mean, we're looking at all exonerations overall. It's your burden to explain why a small sample that's antiquated is better than the entirety of the data that the U.S. Justice Department has. But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, you say in response to our poor police work argument that 10% of people are still going to trial.
Right.
But why does that matter if there's still poor police work for both plea bargains and the trial?
Eddie, all you say is that plea bargaining reduces the quality of police work. You
Yes.
never actually prove that police work is undermining the criminal justice system. But B, we're telling them
Well,
because
actually, you're saying
because
how-
10% of cases still go to trial, they're in problem. The police still have to get to these.
Actually, it's a warrant for why innocent people are convicted, and you didn't respond to
Which
this.
is why at the end of the card it says these sloppy investigations are less likely to lead to the apprehension of the actual guilty.
But that does but you're not actually proving that happens in the status quo.
It's a
So let's go over to their case for a second. Now, they basically said in response to our University of Pennsylvania evidence about bench trials that we had said that we can't offer alternatives. The problem is that so long as it's even possible that there exists an alternative system, then efficiency is not an argument. And efficiency is not a goal of the criminal justice system as they conceded. Insofar as that's true, none of their arguments coming out of their first contention are unique, insofar as there exist systems that do not have any of the harms that we offer. What about their incarceration point or their first subpoint? They never respond to our New York Times evidence where we said that the probation system, which incorporates the vast majority of convictions, is screwed up directly because of plea bargaining, because you're sending a disproportionate amount of people into the probation system, overburdening it, which means that gives these people an incentive to actually recommit a crime immediately. That's why 65% of them reoffend immediately. Look, even if you accept all their statistics, we're both offering statistics. What's going to outweigh everything in today's debate round is that when you give someone probation, a criminal, they're all criminals after all, they're more likely to reoffend because they have immediate access and ability to do so. When you incarcerate someone, the worst crime they can commit is to attack a drug dealer. But it's not a crime against society. You're always going to outweigh our impacts over theirs. What about their last contention about incarceration? They completely dropped the turn I placed from Savitsky, where I said that the reason why the prisons are overcrowded is directly because we send a disproportionate amount of blacks into prison through plea bargaining, because blacks get worse with bargains than whites, because they're exploited by prosecutors. So let's look to the reasons as to why you should vote for us. They drop our Lipke framework, where we said if we prove one of two things, separate the guilty from the innocent, and innocent, then we win the round. What about separate the guilty from the innocent? I think it's very clear that 80% of people get probation, 65% of whom reoffend, go back into the system, clog the system again, and then just reoffend and get probation. It's a cyclic nature in which the system never is solved. So insofar as that's true, we're winning the first burden in our observation. What about the innocence argument? They completely drop our Fordham evidence where we said that prosecutors will use coercion to charge two people with the same exact crime knowing both of them can't be guilty. They try to skirt away from our Leo evidence in the last cross trial, but they didn't respond to it. 85% of people who were wrongfully convicted did so through plea bargaining. Insofar, if you want to protect the innocent people in today's debate, you should vote for us in today's round. Thank you.
Remember the three main goals of the criminal justice system that we give you at the top of our case. We should weigh those over anything else because that is what the Department of Justice says the criminal justice system is for. So first, let's look at criminal correction. We give you two reasons why long incarceration periods are bad for criminal correction. One, long incarceration results in more entrenched criminals because prison is a school for crime, and the longer a prisoner stays in it, the more entrenched a criminal he becomes. Two, the longer he stays in prison, the more severed his bonds with society become, and the more likely he is to recidivate. That is why the Cullen analysis came to the conclusion that there would be an 11% decrease in recidivism with an approximately half of the sentence cut. Our opponents try to respond to this in the last crossfire by telling us that it's somehow methodologically flawed, but they never explained why this database was actually wrong. They just kind of said that Cullen alluded to the fact that it was a little bit, but that doesn't take away from the logical warrants which you should weigh in today's round. Then my opponent's only responses to this deal with probation. We straight turn everything they say about probation when we give you the calling card that says that when incarceration was compared to probation, there was a 7% higher rate of recidivism coming from incarceration. So that should be weighted over everything in today's round. Then our opponent's only response to the argument of prison overcrowding was the idea that blacks are disproportionately being sent to prisons. That doesn't mean that prisons are more overcrowded by plea bargaining. That just means that more blacks are being sent there. But we have to look to the logic behind this. If incarceration is much more likely without plea bargaining, then plea bargaining necessarily prevents prison overcrowding, which gives us access to every single impact of prison overcrowding we give you in the case. Extend all of those and you can vote off of them. Second, let's look at justice. They never proved that bench trials are less work intensive for prosecutors, and at the point where we tell you that prosecutors only have 24 hours in a day in order to get to they won't be able to get to every case. At that point, they need to turn to less resource-heavy methods of prosecution, which plea bargaining is. So we administer justice best through plea bargaining. Third, let's look at public obedience. We tell you that the certainty of punishment is much more important than the severity of punishment, because without the certainty of punishment, the severity of punishment wouldn't be applied to anybody. So at the point where the certainty of punishment is always going to trump the severity of punishment, and that is only available through plea bargaining, we must negate the resolution.
True.